A new study published by the Fraser Institute reveals that the federal government's plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions will impose significant costs on Canadians while also failing to meet the government's own emission reduction target. So, the author of this study joins us now from Guelph, Ontario. Dr. Ross McKitrick is a professor of economics at the University of Guelph and a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute, which is an independent, nonpartisan Canadian public policy think tank. Dr. Ross McKitrick, great to have you on today. Welcome to Bridge City News.
Thanks. My pleasure to be here.
Of course. Okay, so first of all, maybe can you refresh our memories as to what the goals are with the government's emission reduction plan?
The main goal is that by the year 2030, they want to have reduced emissions to at least 40% below where they were in 2005. And in 2019, they were about at the same level as where they were in 2005. So it's like trying to reduce emissions by about 40% below where they were at the start of this decade. And that is quite a big undertaking. They also have an interim goal for 2026, but there's no way they'll get there. So I more or less ignore that part and just look at what will be the effects of their policy plan, and will it achieve the target, and what will it cost for what it does actually accomplish.
Okay, so to achieve these goals, I guess we're seeing increases in carbon tax, clean fuel regulations, and electric vehicle mandates. So these things do have an impact on our wallets, of course, and that's only 6 years away, that 2030 mark. So how could this affect our economy?
Well, people are pretty used to the discussion around the carbon tax. People know that that's raised the cost of fuels and operating farms and industry and that sort of thing. In my study, I point out that the carbon tax is actually only one small part of a much larger package of policies. Another major one you mentioned, the clean fuels regulation. And then beyond that, there's about 140 other regulatory instruments that they're proposing to bring in, spending programs and mandates. There's the emissions cap on the oil and gas sector. There are fertilizer reduction requirements for farms. There's the electric vehicle mandate, building energy efficiency standards. There's a huge list of these regulations. So in the study, what I've done is I've broken it down into the three sections there. So the carbon tax, clean fuels regulation, and then all the other regulatory measures. And the carbon tax is fairly expensive. I don't think it's uh, all that big a deal in comparison. By the end of the decade, it's it's going to cost about $1,100 per worker. So it is a costly policy. But the clean fuels regulation pushes that cost up to about 3,000 per worker, and then all the other regulations, that's where the cost really hits. So then the tally rises up to about $6,500 per worker per year. And for all of that cost, which I think is just so expensive that they're not going to succeed in maintaining these policies. But if they did, it would only get them a little over halfway to the goal of 40% emission reduction. So
Wow. Yeah,
um,
that's a
the
lot of
overall
expense
message is
for what the outcome is.
right. And even on their own reckoning of what the benefits are of reducing emissions, and I think that they've overstated the benefits, but even if we
Yeah.
take that at face value, the package costs at least three times as much as the benefits that they say it will
Yeah, well,
generate.
I guess because their argument is that the Liberal government is using is that any negative impact on the economy is still worth the cost because it's saving the planet from the damage of climate change. But your study, of course, is suggesting that some of those climate damage claims are misleading.
Yeah, I don't go into that part in too much detail. They put out some work last year saying what they thought the value is to the global climate of reducing emissions in Canada, and they peg it at around $200 per ton. And I've written before about how they came up with that number and why I think it's a gross exaggeration. But even if, like I say, we take it at face value, their policy package costs far more than $200 per ton. And some elements of it will be up over $600 per ton. So, on really any reckoning, including their own calculation of it, it costs too much. It's putting a huge cost burden on Canadians, and it's more expensive than it needs to be, just because it's so much regulation. It's going to be an extremely inefficient way of trying to reduce emissions.
Yeah. So if all of these emissions reduction targets are perfectly met within this time frame, and you're saying that they're not going to meet that target, you're saying what was it, 40% of the government's
Yeah,
own targets?
40% by
So how did
2030.
they miscalculate somehow, or just an oversight?
It's always been a puzzle where they come up with these numbers, and I really think that one part of the cabinet doesn't talk to another part, because one of the big drivers of emissions growth is population growth. So at the same time as they're saying we want to have income go up and we want to have emissions go down, and we're going to have extremely rapid population growth through their various immigration programs, they can't all work together. They can't do all three. And in particular, with the emission targets, they would barely make sense if they stuck to historic rates of population growth. But once they started bringing in a number of people and trying to hit a 2% population growth numbers, it just became impossible to even reduce emissions, really, let alone get them down by 40% without um, absolutely crushing the economy in the process.
Right. And like you were saying in your study that it could end up costing, what was it, $6,700 per worker annually. So how is that calculated, and what would that look like practically?
Well, as far as how it's calculated, I have use of a large macroeconomic model that has a lot of detailed representation of every sector in the economy and all the provinces and the tax system and things like that. So it's a matter of representing the carbon tax itself, and then the costs of things like the clean fuels regulation, the cost of EVs and building code changes, just building all those into the model, and then it tracks. Um, for instance, if productivity goes down in certain sectors, or if production costs go up, where all those costs get transmitted through the economy, and so it's a modeling process. The I think people lose sight of the fact that while the carbon tax is expensive, the money does reappear at various points. Not all of it; a lot of it gets wasted, but some of it reappears. But when they put these regulations in place, those destroy. Well, they reduce productivity. They raise the cost of producing goods and services, but there's no offsetting benefit. There's no new money that's created in the process. So regulatory measures typically are much more expensive for accomplishing these kinds of goals compared to something like the carbon tax.
Hmm.
And a lot of those regulations, they haven't really kicked in yet. So people aren't really feeling the pinch of them, and they may not even be aware that they're coming. They also have really much smaller effects on emissions. So the reduction in emissions that you get from things like the EV mandate, it's very small. Like, it'll take decades before that really has an effect on emissions in Canada. But there are a lot of very large upfront costs to it.
Yeah. You mentioned off the top there farmers, and they're affected as well. So I understand that farmers are expected to reduce their use of fertilizer by 30% by 2030. And that seems, I don't know, maybe unrealistic. So what are your thoughts on that?
Um, yeah, and in that case, I mean, the farmers in Canada have long been working at reducing fertilizer use. It's a costly input. They don't waste it, and they get a lot of productivity out of the products that they do use. So this is a case where you have the Minister of the Environment who really has no knowledge about agricultural practices, but he hit upon this idea of forcing the farmers to reduce fertilizer use and just sets a target. And then it's up to the agricultural sector to try to cope with it. ultimately, uh, the way it shows up in an economic analysis is it raises the cost of producing what you are already producing. So if it's still going to be a wheat field or a barley field that you're growing and you can't use the fertilizers that you used to use, you either produce less or you try to produce the same amount, but you have maybe a more labor intensive or you have to swap in some other inputs that you weren't otherwise going to use because they're costlier. So the ultimate effect is it raises the cost of production, reduces productivity, and just pushes us further in this trend, which is a big problem in Canada, that we have had very little productivity growth, and that fundamentally undermines the capacity to raise incomes in the future.
Hmm. Um, you talk a lot about electric vehicles. So, what are some of the problems with the government's EV mandate? What kind of feedback are you hearing from the business sector on this, for example?
Um, I published separately a very detailed study of the EV mandate for Canada. Right now, the market quickly grew around affluent households wanting, Teslas and cars like that. They had a bit of a cool factor to them. But people have also discovered that there are currently very practical difficulties. The electricity is much more expensive than it used to be, and there aren't that many charging stations for what people need. And especially when you get out of the big urban centers, you may just not have any access to charging stations at all. And then they aren't as useful in all weather conditions, especially in Canada. So, proponents of EVs like to point to the fact that some things like batteries are getting cheaper to produce, which is true. But a lot of the things that go into making an electric vehicle are single sourced from China. And China is not going to give us any price cuts on these things. They have an EV industry of their own. They would happily price us right out of the market. So the costs aren't coming down fast enough to meet the EV mandate target. If the technology changes dramatically in the next few years, and if EVs suddenly become really cheap and popular, we don't need a mandate. People will make the switch voluntarily. But if you have to force people to make the switch, essentially you're saying, okay, you can no longer buy a $30,000 Honda or Toyota or something like that. You have to buy a $70,000 EV and get worse performance out of it. And that's the sort of thing that it obviously makes most people worse off. And just adds to the cost of living in Canada.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like there could be safety factors as well with EV. I mean, the thought of being stuck somewhere where there is no charging station is a little bit terrifying. Hopefully, they'll increase that or improve on that. Also, I, I was surprised at how quiet these vehicles are. I mean, they can, and how fast as well. Like I mean, they can just be behind you and didn't even hear it. So I don't know. My mind goes to how many fatalities there could be in the future because of how quiet they are. People are walking across the street and somebody comes zapping through. You don't even hear them and they're on top of you. I don't know. Has anyone addressed that at all?
That is an issue, yeah. And there are proposals of for instance, simulated engine noises, just to make them safer that way. And now EVs do also tend to have very sophisticated um, accident avoidance systems. So in some cases, it may be that if you are a pedestrian, you don't hear it coming, it will know that you're there and will make a signal. But you're right about the safety, especially in a country like Canada, where you've got long distances and sometimes very cold weather. And
Yeah.
really, who wants to set out on a long road trip in an EV through the prairies where you just don't know if there's going to be a charging station? There might be one on the map, but you get there and it may be shut down, and it's the only one
Mhm.
for hundreds of kilometers, and then you're stuck. And so
Scary.
that is an issue that really stands in the way of them being practical. And of
Definitely.
course, other vehicle categories like pickup trucks and large duty vehicles.
Yeah. And,
EVs are a
I
long way
assume
from
the
being able to
government believes it's a
replace
good
those.
sell because, based on its core base of supporters. What are the polls saying about about EVs? Is there any public support for these measures, or are people, what are the polls saying?
Polls can be a bit misleading because
True.
you can ask a poll and make it sound like these are great products, and people will say, "Sure, we should have more EVs on the road." Um, the the important measure is the market data, and are people actually buying them? And so in British Columbia and Quebec, they have very generous subsidy schemes for people, and so they've had higher market penetration there. But in other provinces, the take up has been much too slow to meet the targets that the government has set. And so pretty soon, those sales mandates in 2026 are really going to start to bind. And that means car companies will either have to sell, they'll have to move those cars off the lot, or they'll be charging a penalty on internal combustion engine vehicles. I believe it'll be $20,000 per vehicle will be the penalty that they have to pay if they don't meet their EV sales targets. And so again, polls, I'm sure people will, and if you've been in one, you're right, they accelerate really fast. They're actually quite fun to drive when they're charged. And the challenge, though, is the cost, the inconvenience, um, and the grid problems. People who've looked at, well, where would we get the electricity if everyone in a medium-sized city switched to EVs? We don't have nearly enough electricity for them.
Yeah.
And at the rate that we build power generating facilities in this country, um, we just can't cope with a large scale market penetration of EVs.
Yeah.
Ironically, what you'd start to see is a lot of diesel powered charging stations set up. So people would have to, they can't plug into the grid, so they'd be putting diesel generators out and have EV charging stations. And then at that point, you've just completely defeated the purpose.
Interesting. I mean, it's a topic that can go, you can just talk about it all day, seriously. We are out of time, though, but I really appreciate you being here and sharing your input with your study with us. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thanks so much, Dr. Ross. Dr. Ross McKitrick is a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute and a professor of economics at the University of Guelph. You can read the entire study at fraserinstitute.org.